This lecture introduces the Americas before 1330 with Mesoamerica, specifically relating to three cultures, the Olmec, that of Teotihuacan, and the Mayan. The Americas are in fact divided into four separate regions. North America, comprised today of Alaska, Canada, and the United States, that end with Texas, leading into Central America, and then Mesoamerica, which leads to the Yucatan Peninsula, finally leading to South America, beginning with Colombia in the north. Now, how the Americas were first colonized by humans is disputed. Where were the first settlements and what time did they occur? Because many of the earliest humans that crossed over into the Americas from Africa by way of Asia or Europe is going to ensure that they did not leave permanent structures starting off. The two primary theories are going to relate to crossing the Bering Strait from Russia into Alaska during the last ice age, or a new theory which states that the Pacific cultures are going to make their way to South America and Chile and first settle there. The traditional view, as espoused by historians and archaeologists for the last century, is that from 20,000 to 30,000 years ago, we have Paleolithic hunter-gatherers crossing the Bering Strait into modern-day Alaska. Now, this is going to be made possible because this area was frozen over in the Ice Age until it melted from 12,000 to 10,000 years ago. New evidence, however, demonstrates that Pacific Islanders sailing from Asia to the various islands in the Pacific Ocean are going to have sailed from Easter Island specifically to Chile and have spread from there. Regardless, we find that between 10,000 and 12,000 years ago, the Ice Age ends. At this time, the Western Hemisphere is effectively cut off from the rest of the world until European invaders and expansionists arrive in the 15th century, during the time of the Aztec we will discuss. Now, the cultures that develop can be seen to parallel those in Europe and Asia. That being, the end of the Paleolithic period sees the development of agriculture, whereas in the Mesopotamian region in the Middle East, modern-day Iraq, they would develop, say, wheat and other types of barley. In the Americas, instead, they develop corn, beans, squash, potatoes, tobacco, and avocados. They would domesticate dogs, turkeys, and llamas instead of bulls and pigs and goats in the Near East. The timeline for these civilizations can be seen here, beginning with the Olmec around 1200 BCE, the time in which the Ice Age is going to end, that being 10,000 BCE, and then following up behind that. Then you will see the rise of the Mayan civilization, who are heavily influenced by Teotihuacan, but eventually conquer them, absorbing this culture's architecture, its belief system, and its city planning and organization. Mesoamerica, specifically as seen in this map, stretches from Mexico City to Belize and has a series of small city-states and cultures that have one thing in common, that being the Cosmic Ballgame that all of them play, usually ending in human sacrifice. Many of these cultures had a 260-day divinatory cycle where they would divine the will of the gods and the supernatural universe. And they also had, as we do today, a 365-day ritual and agricultural calendar. So the divinatory cycle is going to cycle much more rapidly than that of the standard year. Now, the Mesoamerican periods are divided into those that mimic and are mirrored by those in the classical world. We have first the formative or pre-classic period between 1500 BCE and 250 CE. This is when the Olmec are going to be dominant. They are displaced by the Mayan in the classical period of 250 to 900 Common Era. You also have at this time the Teotihuacan culture. Now, the post-classic Maya finds them moving into the Yucatan Peninsula away from modern-day Mexico City and the center of Teotihuacan culture's power. This will last from 900 to 1521 Common Era. These reflect the organization and categorization of Greek art, whereby the classic or classical period is meant to understand and reflect the golden age, the best period of a given culture, where we see the distillation and refinement of what that culture cared about and the clearest view of their beliefs. In the ancient Greek world, that would be the period in which we have the birth of philosophy, of playwrights, of statesmen, of Socrates, Pericles, Sophocles, all of these great thinkers, writers, and artists. So we find that in the understanding of Mesoamerican cultural periods, it would be the time before the move to the Yucatan Peninsula. So in Mesoamerica, we find that farming develops between 7000 and 6000 BCE. We should note that farming develops in the Middle East between 10,000 and 8000 BCE, and we see the rise of permanent settlements and civilizations coming around the same time as here in Mesoamerica of 3000 and 2000 BCE. This corresponds with the ancient Sumerians in the Middle East. Here we have the earliest cities and those relating to the Olmec, especially surrounding San Lorenzo. It would be here that Mesoamerica's first great civilization, the Olmec, would rise, producing stone sculpture, ceramics, massive pyramids, and ball courts in their first permanent settlements and civilization. Here we have one in La Venta, Mexico from 900 to 400 BCE, with a pyramid towering over the city of over 100 feet. These ceremonial centers are going to be found with earthen mounds where the elite were housed, specifically rulers and priests. The farmers and most of the population actually live in villages of pole and thatch houses, such as those seen here. Obviously, these settlements are not as permanent and long-lasting, so they do not survive. But we can get an indication of an idea of what most people's lives were like by looking at the current pole and thatch houses and the civilizations that still use them today. At San Lorenzo, the earliest ceremonial center, continuously occupied between 1200 and 900 BCE, we have the so-called Great Pyramid, the earthen mound, overseeing a rectangular court and basalt column. In this area, we have a giant earthwork that is going to tower over an area 3/4 of a mile long. It is going to be accompanied by a stone drainage system that filters off rainwater and waste respectively, akin to those in earlier designs for Hellenistic Greek cities and those in early Rome. The palace, along with the ball court and workshop, all have been uncovered through archaeological excavation. The 100-foot artificial sacred mountain was linked to the creation story for the Olmec and this type of cultural cosmology very similar to ancient Egypt. So in ancient Egypt, the pyramids and the builders of the pyramids were so obsessed with this true pyramid shape merely because of the fact that it reflected a bin, or the shape of land that rose out of water at the dawn of creation, on top of which Amun-Ra, the sun god, was able to dry up the land and thus create life for man. Beneath these massive structures, we find a series of tableaux, such as that seen here, made of jade, greenstone, granite, and sandstone, with a series of figures that are going to be 6 1/4 to 6 7 inches tall. They are buried beneath these. Here we have 15 of them, made of a range of different stones, perhaps representing the significance of the different characters who surround and converge on a single figure. The oblong stones are actually going to be called celts, and they are centered around La Venta, Mexico here, much like these almost surfboard-looking stones in the background. That would be similar to those we would be familiar with in the Neolithic period in England, such as the megalithic hinges of Stonehenge that are going to be built around the same time, that are a circle surrounding this interior space. In the case of Stonehenge, we have an astronomical observatory, but relating to a connection to the supernatural and to connect that with the mortal world. And of course, similar theories have been espoused for the Olmec examples. Now, with the Olmec, we find that their art and physiognomy are going to be very consistent, for they often portray slouching bodies with elongated heads, almond-shaped eyes, and downward-turned, almost frowning mouths. The ears have holes in them for earrings, and we know that they were originally dressed, and this would have rotted away over time. Their knees are going to be bent with their arms forward, thus it is as though they are walking towards something, reenacting a particular event perhaps. Now we know they were ritualistically dug up periodically and reburied, set up in the earth. They are buried underneath a plaza as one of several of these tableaus found at San Lorenzo. They are periodically going to be dug up, much like the ritualistic resurrection and digging up of past ancestors in Neolithic settlements, such as at Teotihuacan in Turkey. Here we have an example of them digging the areas, placing the stones over these tableaus and covering them back up. So ritualistically, this has to do with the divinatory calendar. These installations have been found throughout Mesoamerica and so tell of a common cosmological event, reliving such an event, such as a convergence on a messianic and or creator or godlike figure. The Olmec also produce monumental sculpture, these massive, massive sculptural heads from material quarried and transported from a great distance. There are 10 alone at San Lorenzo. This specific colossal head from the Olmec culture, dating from 1200 to 900 BCE, made of basalt, is 7 feet 5 inches tall. They range from 5 to 12 feet overall and are going to be between 5 and 20 tons each. They are all adult males, showing us that we have a patriarchal civilization, for women are not shown, with caps with chin straps holding them on. Large round ear spools can be seen in each, while almond-shaped eyes and flat broad noses, along with thick protruding lips and downward turned mouths, are going to be the appropriate physiognomy also seen in the small tableaus and figurines we just talked about. The way in which they are presented does not necessarily mean they are realistic or naturalistic, but instead have the oversized character of other iconic sculptures like the portrait of Constantine in ancient Rome, whereby we have a large visage of a male figure with some of the characteristics that he would have had at the time, yet removed from any notion of individuality or imperfection. So these peoples would have had a similar physiognomy with a broad, flat nose, almond-shaped eyes, and large protruding lips. But they would have been somewhat abstracted to reach this gigantic, colossal scale. Turning from the Olmec to the culture surrounding Teotihuacan in Mexico, we have a very influential civilization that would give the following civilization, the Maya, city planning, a lot to do with their religion and their infrastructure. They would be located near Mexico City and be the inspiration for many myths surrounding them, such as El Dorado. The organization of the civilization is going to be the model for the Maya as well, where we find a king or high priest responsible for keeping cosmic order and ensuring that divinities are satisfied, usually by way of bloodletting or human sacrifice. Surrounding them, we have a council or priesthood, often part of the royal family, then nobles, and finally merchants, artisans, and then commoners. This is the class society that will exist until the intervention of Europeans here soon in the 15th century. The popular myth surrounding this can be seen in films such as El Dorado. Now, Teotihuacan becomes very wealthy because of its trade in obsidian, which is 500 times sharper than surgical steel and was used around the globe, from Neolithic settlements that can be identified in the Middle East and Turkey to ancient Rome, where they would use this type of obsidian for eye surgery. They would be exchanged for luxury items such as feathers, and we will see that a measure of one's status can be seen in the type of headdress one would wear. So this culture precedes that of the Aztecs, which are founded in the area after Teotihuacan falls to the Maya. In 200 Common Era, we have the first major urban center founded. This center is one of commerce and manufacturing. Here you see the Avenue of the Dead, so called by the later Aztec civilization that supplanted it. It is 9 square miles and has a population of 125,000, making it the largest in all of the Americas at this time, and among the largest in all of the world if we are to compare the developments in ancient Rome, Asia, and Africa. Now, the city is designed around a grid with apartment compounds, as they are known, and the Avenue of the Dead that transects the city right in the center. This Avenue of the Dead, as mentioned, is an Aztec term, and the Teotihuacan culture did not use it. These pyramids seen here, that of the moon, the sun, and the feathered serpent, are going to be enlarged several times over the course of the civilization and are going to characteristically be used for ceremonies, elevating those in charge, such as the priestly class, above on a platform where an entire audience can see them from below. Teotihuacan, in fact, remained a pilgrimage center for the Aztecs, as they believed that the gods created the sun and the moon here. Hence, the tradition of the pyramid of the sun and the moon remained important, much as Mecca or Jerusalem is to this day for Christians and Muslims and Jews. The pyramids are going to immediately evoke in the popular imagination of Westerners the Great Pyramids at Giza of the Egyptian culture, whereby we also find 3 massive pyramids by the pharaohs Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure in that order. The largest, of course, being that of Khufu's, and that is the comparable size we have here in this great city. The largest one, in fact, is 200 feet tall and 720 foot at the base. This is comparable to Khufu's pyramid at Giza, seen here. The stone stairway is going to lead from level to level, whereby the exterior would be stuccoed and painted, built over a multi-chambered cave with a spring, most likely a popular religious destination and pilgrimage spot before the Teotihuacan culture co-opted it as their own. The much smaller but no less impressive Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent here in Teotihuacan, Mexico, is going to be a great example of the type of style practiced by this culture that would be very influential for the next ones to follow. Produced around 200 Common Era, this pyramid was the focal point of worship early on in the city's history. It is one of the older structures found at Teotihuacan. It has 7-tiered talud tablero slope and panel construction sections. Now, the talud tablero, or slope and panel construction, consists of the appropriately and eponymously named talud and tablero. The talud is the sloping base section that is going to provide these platform for supports, whereas the tablero is the entablature or frame, much like you would find on an ancient Greek temple or a later Roman temple. These entablatures would be at the top of columns and would form the lintel and the post and lintel structure. The feathered serpents that give this pyramid its name are going to float in watery space. They are flat and angular in a very abstract style and would have originally been brightly painted. Here we have an example of this type of serpent with the mouth hollowed out, eyes wide open and peering forward, with the feathers coming off of the hood here of the serpent. This is very different than the Olmec culture and quite distinct, for the Olmec are going to prize a curvilinear and organic design to their male figures, whereas the much more imaginative and fantastical creatures seen at Teotihuacan would be angular, and both the creatures, the subject, and the style would be adopted later by the Maya and the Aztec. The squarish headdress seen on many of the figures represent the storm god of warfare, and was often worn by warriors in many of these Mesoamerican cultures. So the squarish form of this decorative element can be seen in paintings and in different sculptures throughout the various city-states, from the regions here in Mexico City all the way to the Yucatan Peninsula. Inside of these pyramids, and especially the feathered serpent pyramid, we have a very militaristic message in which dozens of sacrificial victims are going to be shown wearing necklaces made of human jawbones with their arms tied behind their backs, showing that they were unwilling sacrificial participants in this ritual that is very common throughout Mesoamerican cultures. As far as the domiciles or domestic structures are concerned, surrounding Teotihuacan, they are all rectangular, one-story structures with high walls covered in paintings arranged around courtyards, much like that seen in Roman villa design that face inward. And like Roman villas, such as are preserved at Pompeii and Herculaneum, those at Teotihuacan are going to be painted in fresco, painted on fresco, buon fresco more specifically, on damp or wet lime plaster. They are then polished to give a smooth finish to the surface and decorate the very lavish apartment areas, if you will, of the city. Here we have an example of how Western Europeans are going to be taught to produce fresco, and this is going to be practiced without any type of intervention or knowledge of this other culture here at Teotihuacan. The types of decorations seen in these domestic interiors are, interestingly enough, of spiritual and ritualistic activities to ensure that the gods are satiated and satisfied, usually through bloodletting rituals and ceremonies, such as that seen here. Now, in this ceremony, we are intending to revitalize the earth by the sacrifice of blood given back to it and expected of these peoples by the gods. The style, just like that in the feathered serpent pyramid, is going to be one reflecting a flat, angular, or abscon shown in these frescoes with processions of similar figures in rows, seen in profile. Now, the colors that are going to be used are either going to be very bright and polychromed or a monochromatic red, appropriate for bloodletting rituals. In the painting, we see a representation of the bloody magui, which represents the agave americana, or a plant with spines that were used by the Teotihuacan culture for bloodletting. Down below, we see these agave plants growing out of rectangular plots of earth, while a figure dressed in a headdress of the Quetzal bird, showing his high status as a priest or elite member of the civilization here, who's going to be giving back to the land with blood coming out of his right hand, throwing it into the ground as he chants ritualistically. So here we have what would naturalistically be represented as this headdress with the bright feathers of the Quetzal bird, this bluish green color, along with the plant that is abstracted here, but still recognizable, with the sharp spines that can be used to prick the flesh to draw blood from men and women. The blood can be seen here coming from the right hand in front of the figure, whereas out in front of his mouth comes a ritualistic chant. Therefore, we need blood to give back to the civilization, give back to the ground and the gods to appease them. Now, we know that in the 7th century, the ceremonial center of Teotihuacan is sacked and burned, but this permanent decline does not mean that the culture is not influential. On the contrary, after its fall, it becomes very influential for the next civilizations that follow it, namely the Maya, then the Aztec after that. The Maya, as seen in films like Apocalypto, are going to be a very important and powerful civilization that are going to dominate the post-classic era. They produce dense cities that are going to be pierced with pyramids and temples and palaces. They have the most advanced hieroglyphic writing system, and they would be the ones to perfect the Mesoamerican calendrical system of 365 days, along with the divinatory cycle. Now, the Mayan writing system is not like the hieroglyphics of the Egyptians, whereby a picture or represent one letter or sound. Instead, the Maya developed a logosyllabic approach, where ideographs or logographs, that being an image, represents an entire word instead of just a sound. Now, you are going to append with that a set of symbols that stand for other sounds and syllables. So a jaguar, for instance, would represent the word Balaam, whereas a object in front accompanying it would be Balaam, whereas one underneath it representing feet would be Balama, whereas both together would be Balama. So this is going to show you how they had a more succinct writing system that could not have the range of Egyptian hieroglyphs, but still allowed them to record more effectively than their predecessors the great historical deeds and military victories of their people. This writing system would be deciphered only in the 1950s, which is very late if we consider that the Egyptian hieroglyphic system was decoded in 1822. Now, since the 1950s, we know that these writings were solely used for ceremonial records of historical events, royal marriages, the birth of heirs, alliances, and military victories. Very different than the first civilization to develop writing in the Middle East, the Sumerians, who used cuneiform first to record business transactions for food. Now, we know that this interest in the record of the elite can also be seen in how their society was divided into these competing city-states that were constantly at war with each other. Each one had a hereditary ruler and an elite class of priests that would govern each city-state. Thus, that is the most important aspect. So this is what they record and put the most effort into recording. Much as the Teotihuacan civilization, you have at the apex of the civilization and literal pyramid the king or high priest, who would have surrounding him the royal family or priesthood, then nobles, merchants, and finally commoners and slaves. So the understanding of class was very much a pyramidal structure. These individuals would establish their legitimacy through divine ancestry, showing that they can trace their lineage back to the gods themselves. They would support this idea with elaborate rituals, ball games reflecting the cosmic order of the universe, bloodletting ceremonies, and human sacrifice. The ritual ball game played here by the Maya reflected that of many of these Mesoamerican cultures, for it is played on a long rectangular court with a large, solid, heavy rubber ball, like that seen here at Copan, Honduras. The game would be played in an enclosed space much like racquetball, where the ball would be bounced off of these sloping pylon walls, as the goal is to get it through a hoop. The goals are actually large stone rings set in the walls 25 feet above the field, and of course it is challenging to get them that high, not using one's hands. The heavy padded players would direct the ball to the goal using their elbows, knees, and hips, not their hands. So much like soccer today, we find the challenge becomes directing using these team-like strategies, directing this hard, solid rubber ball to this elevated platform with the precision necessary to make it through. Regardless, these captive warriors that they would capture from neighboring tribes would be forced to play and would end in human sacrifice. The Maya would migrate to the Yucatan Peninsula in the post-classic period, taking with them ideas from the Olmecs and their technology, and trading with those in Teotihuacan, such as with obsidian glass. So moving, we find new pyramids and new civilizations are going to be founded here. The first one we will look at is at Tikal. Tikal in modern-day Guatemala is one of the largest of these cities with 70,000 inhabitants. It is not built on a grid-like plan like that at Teotihuacan, and instead conforms to the uneven terrain of the rainforest, containing in this city plazas, pyramid temples, and ball courts. Here we find kings will be buried in funerary pyramids that tower above the open expanse and central area of these cities. At Tikal, we can see this 9-level pyramid here off to the right. In 378 Common Era, warriors from Teotihuacan killed the Tikal king, thereby influencing the culture. They would take, after this, the pyramids from Teotihuacan and adopt it and adapt it to a Mayan aesthetic with these stepped pyramids. King Causeways is going to have his own pyramid for his royal tomb built seen here in Temple 1, built and completed around 734 Common Era. The vertically oriented and very tall pyramid is the opposite of those found at Teotihuacan, which were broader and flatter. Here we have a 140-foot high pyramid with 9 layers, equaling the 9 levels of the underworld. This is going to be reflected and mirrored in the Christian tradition, who holds that there are 9 hierarchies of angels that reflect the 9 levels of heaven. This in turn mirrors and corresponds to the 9 circles and levels of hell, equipped with the differing punishments that lead to the worst, the traitors, and finally with Satan in the 9th level frozen. The roof comb, this protrusion at the top, is a crest that rises above the roof. Originally, this would have been painted brightly and would have been painted with sculpture or polychrome sculpture. This rises above the tops of the trees and is visual and visible for these rituals in this plaza below. So no matter where you are, you can see what is being performed, just as the human sacrificial rituals and bloodletting sacrificial ceremonies that took place with the Maya and those at Teotihuacan. At Palenque, you're going to find another Mayan city that has another adaptation from the pyramids at Teotihuacan and the idea of a divine ruler. Here we find at Palenque the tomb of Pakal the Great, with a temple of inscriptions, as it is called, along with an administrative center. So Kinich Jahab Pakal, literally the shield is what Pakal means, becomes known as Pakal the Great. He ruled from 615 to 683 Common Era and commissioned a city be built atop a ridge that is over 300 feet high. Thus, it is naturally defensible as a citadel. He is going to create this city in a terraced fashion, built into the mountains with aqueducts surrounding it, bringing water to this great city, and also providing a way in which to control the waste management of the city. The center of the city is a palace or administrative center with a throne room seen here. Walking up to the palace as you would walk up the side of this mountain, 300 feet up this elevation, we would, of course, understand the ruler to also be elevated above mortal men and to rule thanks to the divine sanction of the gods. Here we have a reconstruction showing the central areas of this so-called palace and the reconstruction at Palenque. The funerary pyramid, otherwise known as the Temple of Inscriptions, which houses the tomb of Pakal the Great, was finished around 683 Common Era and is going to be 75 feet above the plaza. Of course, also allowing us to see any of these rituals that would take place here from anywhere in the surrounding plaza. The 9 levels reflect the 9 levels seen in Temple 1 of Jasa Chan Kawil of 734. The shrine on the summit of the one here for the Temple of Inscriptions for Pakal the Great, however, has a portico with 5 entrances and a vaulted inner chamber. So you would ascend to the top of this pyramid, only then to descend into it with this great vaulted interior space to see the tomb of Pakal the Great. 3 large panels of text on the back wall of the outer chamber link Pakal's accomplishments with the history of the city. Thus, we have this decisive connection between the life of this ruler and the rise and success of his city. The corbelled vaulted stairway then leads you down beneath, 80 feet down below, to the chamber with Pakal's tomb. This would remind those familiar with the great pyramids at Giza, but especially the tomb of Khufu, of the grand vaulted gallery that you would descend down to get to the original false tomb entrance. Here we have a notion of what the scale would be for this great interior space that leads you to confront the king in the afterlife who transitions before our eyes. The sarcophagus of Pakal the Great, here in Pakal's tomb, found in the Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque, Mexico, is going to be quite elaborate indeed and shows us the connection between the ruler and that of the maize god. In fact, he is shown as the Mayan maize god, or god of corn as we would understand it, covered with a green jade on his mask, much like a funerary mask such as that of Agamemnon for the Mycenaeans. He is in a uterus-shaped sarcophagus, thus in the womb of the earth, and represents the balance between the underworld and the earth itself. The ancestors of Pakal off to the side of this great sarcophagus are going to emerge to witness the death and descent of this great king to the underworld. The lid of the sarcophagus of Pakal the Great shows us this, as we find the heavens above with birds as well as the mouth of the gaping underworld below are familiar to civilizations across the globe. This is shown at the moment of death, as Pakal falls into the jaws of the underworld, similar to the jaws of hell as shown in Last Judgment scenes and/or scenes of hell of Christianity in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. It's understood as a great gaping kind of leviathan that eats individuals once they die. Above, we find rising the axis mundi, which is going to be the celestial realm, out of which a fantastical bird is going to be perched on top, thus showing us the celestial realm of the gods overseeing the death of this great king. The branches off to the side, much like the bloodletting ritual we looked at a moment ago, shows us how these rulers stayed in power, that bloodletting was necessary to sustain royal power and is demanded of the elite and royals. Underneath this great sarcophagus, we have a stucco portrait of Pakal, again shown as the maize god, with a headband of maize flowers and upswept hair. We find that the maize god represents the cycle of death, then rebirth in the planting and harvesting of corn in Mesoamerica. So therefore, this notion of rebirth and the promise of new life and renewed life would be something that rulers would want to associate themselves with, just as later Christian rulers want to associate themselves with Christ, who overcomes death and is going to be the promise of renewed life and resurrection. The sloping forehead seen here, an elongated skull, which is created through head binding or an artificial cranial deformation, is going to be part of the Mayan ideal of beauty, which is rounded out by large curved nose with an ornamental bridge and full lips with an open mouth. We find that the head binding is practiced throughout Central and South America, whereby while infants' heads are forming their shape, the heads are going to be compressed systematically until we have this elongated cranium or this bulging ovoid-like shape. The bridge on the nose would have been added by jewelry, thus flattening out the forehead with the tip of the nose. This was an ideal of beauty, and so obviously ornaments and different jewelry were designed and developed in order to make the ruler seem ideal and more perfect than an average citizen. The final thing we'll look at relating to the Mayan civilization here is the shield jaguar along with Lady Zoc. This is in lintel 24, coming from the Mayan culture, produced around 725. This is going to be a relief stele. Now, it shows us something very significant about the Mayans in that it is the subject relating to their elite and not gods. So these are not the gods of the Maya, but of their ruling elite. This will be very different than the Aztecs that will follow, who most likely and often show their gods. Here we have a relief stele of low relief, so we find that it projects relatively slightly from the background and has the logographs here showing us and detailing who these individuals are and that we are witnessing a bloodletting ceremony by Lady Zoc. Here we have Lady Zoc, the wife and queen of Shield Jaguar the Great, who stands over her, kneeling below. The subject is much like the stele from the Amarna period of the Egyptians with Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti. Thus we have the ruling king here standing, holding a torch with a kneeling queen and wife. The king, of course, is going to keep his power through these bloodletting ceremonies. So the elite are expected to shed blood. So the bloodletting ritual here shown at night as the husband carries the torch to illuminate and to show people that his wife is shedding blood is going to relate here the power of the king through his headgear, which has a shrunken human head from a sacrificial victim on it, showing another type of bloodletting practiced by these peoples. Now, here we find the queen is pulling a rope with thorns through a perforation in her tongue, and this is required of royalty to maintain their rule and to continue human life. So not only do we sacrifice captured slaves opposing tribes and warriors, but the ruling elite must also let their own blood in order to ensure the gods are satiated and slaked with their thirst. So like Egypt, we find they are presented in very strict profile and frontal views. So we find that the hands and or the eyes would be shown frontally, but everything else in profile, other than Queen or Lady Zoc's torso. So this is going to relate the strict understanding of hierarchy for the Maya. So the Mesoamerican cultures, we should summarize, develop large-scale stone sculpture and architecture, and like the Sumerians, they will glorify the ruling elite and demonstrate their connection to the gods by building these elevated structures like pyramids and ziggurats from the Near East and Egypt to showcase these elaborate rituals and get closer to the gods, equating them with their divine rulers on earth. Next time we will continue on by looking at Central and South and North American art and developments outside of Mesoamerica.